sellers and service providers to advertise their products beyond showing information and images that reveal technical product details. Debating this round are China on side proposition and Team USA who are opposing. The adjudicators for this round are Luke Churchyard from South Africa, Morris Katiel from Greece, and Christopher Sanchez from Germany. I now invite the first speaker for side proposition to open the debate.
Too long, advertisements have been preying on the insecurities of people by creating a stereotype that makes people feel inadequate and unable to live a good life if they cannot buy into that stereotype and purchase that product. Proposition wants to free consumers from the constructed stereotypes by advertisement and restore consumer agencies and make consumption decisions that they think are best for themselves. First, let's talk about our model. 4 things. First, we would ban sellers and service providers from revealing any additional information other than technical details on things like the internet, TV, the billboard, or packaging of the product. Second, what do we mean by technical details? We say those are details that are relevant to the functionality of the product, which means if it's an electronic product, it means things like the electronic capacities, the processors, the function of the phone, what are the applications in the phone. If it's a makeup, we say it's about its functions, its ingredients, but without putting it on people like celebrities like Rihanna or putting it on models. Thirdly, we say we will cancel all brand names and rather give every product a product ID number and make them to be all packaged in plain white box with technical details written on the box. Fourthly, we say we are okay with things like political advertising or promoting feminist messages that appear on TV because they're different from consumer advertising, which the aim is to sell a certain product instead of sell a certain ideology, as we see in political campaign and feminist campaign. In my speech, 2 things. First, I'm going to tell you why advertisement beyond technicality lead to the exploitation of people's insecurities and why that's bad. Second, why we enable more competition and innovation that ultimately will benefit consumers. My second speaker will tell you how we benefit social change. Before I move on, yes.
Would you ban Delta Airlines from running ads about the charity work they do in sub-Saharan Africa because it's separate from the product?
No, we simply say that it's not in the debate because in this debate we're talking about selling a certain product that you want people to buy. Rather, when you're talking about charities, they're aiming to help a certain group of people instead of selling a certain product. Coming to the first thing, why advertisement beyond technicality lead to exploitation? Let's be very clear about the context. We're living in a world with greater consumerism, which means that people are likely to purchase things not necessarily because they need those things, but because they want them. And most of the times, our desire for a certain product is manufactured by producers because they market their products in a way that ties the product to your own identities, which means if you don't buy a certain product, you will feel inadequate or a hollowing out of your identity, and ultimately it leads to a coercion for consumers to feel that they need more products, they have to buy a certain product. What are the harms of this? 3 things. First, we say it disproportionately targets women and minorities. Why is that so? 2 reasons. Structural incentive. Structural incentive of advertisers is to pander to the existing power structure. Things like patriarchy or the majority who have more political and financial power. As we see in examples of De Beers, which is a South African wedding ring company which market to men to say that if you buy a certain ring, you will have greater chances of having sex with a woman. We say those are all things that objectifies women and something we reject. Second, even if we're not talking about they're pandering to existing power structure, most of the advertisers have the incentive to create and manufacture a new stereotype that they want people to buy into. And these are things eat in their fancy restaurant and put that advertisement on TV. The second thing we think is harmful is because it disproportionately harms the poor. Why is that so? Because first, advertisement exclusively create a consumerist lifestyle, which links your self-worth to what you can purchase or what you can buy in life. Why is that harmful? Because the poor in the status quo have less purchasing power, which means that they're less likely to fulfill that kind of lifestyle, and thus they will feel less self-worth simply because they cannot buy that fancy product. We give you the example of how a Chinese student sells his kidney in order to buy a new iPhone because of the pernicious impact of consumerism, that he thinks that no matter at what cost, he should get that new version of iPhone. But thirdly, those kind of harms are not limited just for the poor. They are harming everyone in society, including the middle class and the rich, simply because of the reason that it creates consumerism. Why is consumerism bad? Two reasons. First, because what we need to recognize is that everything is a zero-sum game, which means that the more you can get directly leads to the less the other person can get. This means that if we have a consumerist society, we will never have a scenario in which everyone is happy with their life, in which everyone will feel a kind of meaning tied to their life. You're always going to harm a group of people. Second, because we say they're making life as a means to an end, which is consumerism, rather than an end in itself. What does it mean? We give you example of a lot of people who would choose jobs that will give them more pay instead of jobs that they actually love. We give you example because people are more likely to choose jobs that make better pay as they can get more money and reach the consumerist goal that the society is pushing forward this narrative. But fourthly, we say we're going to preempt their argument that they can never regulate this kind of problem, simply because most of the advertisement and their stereotypes are subtle and subconscious, which means you cannot quantify and you do not know what are the impacts of the advertisement on consumers. You can never regulate something that you cannot quantify and you do not know the exact impact. So how does our side change this? By two ways. First, we break the bond between the brand and the product, which means that we break things like brand loyalty. Now people are no longer confined by brand loyalty or the rigid stereotype provided by a certain brand. Second, we encourage rational consumption, which means that now consumers are going to evaluate a product only based on its functionality or the specifications of the product, rather than thinking of whether I can seem more wealthy if I buy this product. Why is that a good thing? Very simple. Because first, if you make more rational choices, it means better management of your personal finance. Second, because we allow people to find alternative sources of their life worth or of their life meaning instead of being hinged upon consumerism. Now, coming to the second thing, why we enable more competition and innovation. There are two problems in the status quo. First, we say there's a disparity between wealthy and poor companies, which means that wealthy companies have more access to the avenues and advertisement. They can build brand loyalty. They have more power to construct the stereotype for consumers. And the mechanism of change is that we make it equal we equalize the playing field by allowing companies to compete with each other based on the technicalities or the functions of their products. That's how we allow things like startup with very little initial brand loyalty or very little access to advertisement to change. Second problem we identify in the status quo is that advertisement often serves as a mask for low-quality products or products that does not actually have the innovative traits that the companies advertise for. We give the example of iPhone. When they give new iPhones, they probably do not have a lot of innovations, but they brand it or they market it to have a lot of innovation. And it clouds the judgment of consumers. In the end, we benefit consumers because we create more creation and innovation in the market. We give them better choices, we give them higher quality products. We're so proud to propose.
Okay, so I'd like to thank the speaker of said...
Just wait.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to thank first speaker of side proposition for delivering their speech, and would like to invite first speaker of our
When Delta runs an advertisement talking about its charity work building medical clinics in sub-Saharan Africa, or when Dove runs the Like a Girl campaign that empowers women to pursue things that most people think are just for men, or even when Audi runs an advertisement talking about how their company recently implemented a policy to ensure that there are both men and women working for the company, they aren't doing that because they really just want to share with people what great things their company is doing. They are doing that in order to promote their brand and sell products. When side proposition tells you that they would allow companies to do things like this on their side of the house, that is a round losing concession, because they acknowledge that all of these things are legitimate things for people to consider when making decisions about what sorts of products to buy. That is the core question in this round. It is absolutely a right that we support, and it's why side proposition loses today's debate. Before I introduce some rebuttal to side proposition material and talk about our first two substantive arguments, I'd just like to clarify a couple of things in this round. First, our side would not allow things like false advertising if a company actively lies about something that their product does, like cigarette companies lying about the health effects of their products. We obviously wouldn't allow that on our side of the house. But second, again, the core question in today's debate is product detail the only thing that consumers should or should have the right to make decisions about when they're deciding whether or not to buy products? This is particularly true in a world where, in some cases, products are largely just functionally in terms of technical details relatively the same. The difference between a Nivea shampoo and an Olay shampoo is pretty much the same. It is up to consumers to decide whether they want to value things like the company's values or policy when they're making this decision. What does, in fact, advertisements that extend beyond things like, beyond technical details look like? Yes, it does look like flashy packaging and celebrities, but it also looks like companies promoting positive values, companies promoting their own charity work. All of these are things that companies do as marketing techniques to promote their brand. We think consumers have the right to know about these and consider them when they're making decisions. With that, let's introduce some responses to the material that they brought. They basically had two ideas. First, on reinforcing negative stereotypes, and second, on creating better choices about which products to buy and improving the quality of these products overall. On this first idea about perpetuating stereotypes, we have four responses. First, the fact of the matter is that these insecurities already exist, and to the extent that companies are preying on them, it's not like we're making them more increased on our side of the house, they already exist. But second, we actually tell you that company messaging is more likely to be positive than exclusionary and negative, at the point where companies have every incentive to promote as many people as possible to buy their product. It's more likely to be inclusive and positive. And third, to the extent that shaming messages were a marketing strategy in the past, we think that society is generally, in the large part, moving away from that. There is huge backlash to discriminatory policies. For example, when Dell came out with a line of laptops exclusively for women, that was pretty problematic, or when companies engage in body shaming in the status quo to promote their products, there's massive backlash to that. And we see more and more companies like Fenty by Rihanna promoting inclusivity and body positivity instead of like shaming women. But fourth and finally, we tell you that actually allowing companies to use things other than the technical details of their product to promote their product actually leads to a check back against those sorts of policies. They talked about the example of De Beers. What we tell you is that when other companies were able to talk about things like the way that they made their product more humanely than De Beers, when they were doing advertising, which notably does not include the technical details of that product, they were able to call out De Beers for their massive human rights abuses, and this was something that we think consumers have the right to consider when they're making decisions. But on their other argument about increasing consumerism and leading to better products, First, this argument assumes that all products are super different. We don't think this is true, and we think particularly in these cases, people need to be able to choose other factors. Second, we think disparities in competition with advertising still exist at the point where the biggest companies are still going to be able to put out the most volume of advertising. These disparities are still going to exist. We actually think it's better on our side of the house when small companies are able to differentiate themselves by talking about the fact that they are in fact a small brand, rather than just focusing on product details. With that, let's introduce our first argument about how we better decision making for consumers and companies. First, let's talk about consumers. We tell you that what they say is spin actually helps consumers make decisions about what products to use. What does advertising do? It basically packages positive things about the product in easily digestible, appealing ways to attract people to that product. It's not just raw product details, which can be really dry and boring for people to sift through. By using this packaging, people are able to learn more about the product and decide better for them. But also it means that consumers buy things that they otherwise wouldn't because it is so dry and technical. For example, in many financial planning advertisements, there's illustrations of people pulling a line of string to see how far their current financial reserves will get them in the future. This isn't about product details, but it illustrates that a lot of people have, not enough money to get them through retirement. We think that this illustration, these positive illustrations, allow people to, say, buy financial planning services when they otherwise wouldn't, actually bettering consumer decision making. But on to our second argument in today's round about how we encourage companies to engage in positive social policies. 3 ideas under this, but before I introduce them, go.
You may get corporate responsibility in some cases, but how does that interact with the other cases where Asian women are told they have to make their faces whiter to look beautiful?
We actually think the fact that companies promote this is something that consumers have the right to make decisions about. If a consumer sees companies promoting these toxic mentalities, they have the right to choose to move to another company that doesn't engage in those practices. And we actually see a lot of societal backlash against things like that in the status quo. This sparks conversations about existing perpetuations of insecurities. We think this is very positive. But now on to how companies promote social movements. 3 ideas under this. The first is by promoting social activism and charity. To boost PR, companies engage in things like social outreach. This is the Delta example we've talked about. This is Ann Taylor running leadership programs for young girls. They do this to promote their brand, and in a world where they can't use this to market themselves, then the incentive to pursue those programs goes away. But second, it leads to better company policy. The ability to advertise about the practices that your company engages in creates an incentive to better those policies. This is companies like Audi implementing gender equality policies, or fair trade companies talking about how they use more positive labor practices in the global south to produce their product. The fact that companies are able to use these sorts of things to promote their product, which, note, are entirely separate from the technical details, incentivizes better labor practices. Third and finally, we get actually more positive social messaging. Why are we more likely to promote positive values than negative values, as they say on their side of the house? We think that more positive values are far more inclusive and more likely to draw more people to your product. Companies have every incentive to do this. This is things like the Dove Like a Girl campaign, which empowers women, the helpful Honda dealer ads, which promote values of helpfulness in society, and the Coca-Cola Pour the World a Coke campaign, which talked about increasing racial integration and decreasing discrimination. We think all of these would go away on their side of the house. But finally, we think that consumers fundamentally have the right to consider all of these things. And if there is, in fact, a negative value being perpetuated, that leads to discourse, and it's a legitimate choice for consumers to be able to make not to purchase that product, to boycott that product. Consumers have the right to decide if I want to buy the same shampoo, roughly the same shampoo, from a company that promotes the rights of women in the global south versus one that does not. We think companies should do this. We're very proud to work with them.
I would like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to the
Panel, on proposition we think, the reason why I should aspire to be a doctor should never be because I want to buy a certain watch, or live in a certain home, or drive a certain car. We think the aspirations of individuals for far too long have been focused on the materialistic ends that they can buy or purchase at the end of their career with. We think that was abhorrent, because we think the only way to truly live a dignified life was to be able to have individuals focusing on the things that they can access, the way in which they live their lives, the jobs they have, and the hobbies that they adore, rather than the materials that they may or may not be able to buy. Because of that, I'm going to address this debate in two questions. Firstly, on the consumers, secondly, on social change. But before that, I want to point out two things that Leader of Opposition missed entirely. The first one was the second argument that our first speaker brought to you, the one on producers. That is to say, she explained to you why oftentimes larger companies have an entrenched power when it comes to the competition of advertising. That they're uniquely able to do things like running campaigns off of the backs of expensive celebrities. That means that oftentimes it means that they're able to crowd out other companies at the expense of functionality. That is to say, they disincentivize competition to focus on the functionalities of items, but rather their ability to advertise them. And this then became problematic, because it meant that their side neglected the actor that Stone tells you about. The actor that can benefit off of the increased functionality that is the result of competition. Individuals of lower socioeconomic status that are now able to purchase functional items because those are the result of competition. That prices of good items can now go down because companies focus on the functionality of items rather than their ability to advertise them. The second thing that they completely ignore is the worldview that we present to you. One that is much more positive. That is to say, one that rather than focusing on the ends that you try to buy, but rather the means by which you try to get those ends. The lives that you live trying to accumulate the materialistic things that their side wants to focus on. So, I'm going to talk firstly about the consumers, the bulk of analysis they brought to us, and secondly, I'm going to give you a unique substantive that addresses the end of their Leader of Opposition speech, which is social change. We told you three things when it came to consumers. The first thing we explained to you was that they are oftentimes resulted to uninformed consent. That is to say, the manufactured consent created by the advertisement is oftentimes manipulative and takes advantage of the vulnerabilities that these individuals have. Because of this, we told you importantly, when it came to sacrificing the money that these individuals earn from a living wage, it became important to protect their ability to actually buy the products that benefited them rather than the ones that had the money to advertise themselves properly. The only response we heard here was at the end of Leader of Opposition, where they tell us that individuals should have a right to purchase these items. I have three responses. Firstly, the reason why this is not a right is because the necessity to buy these items is oftentimes created by these advertisements in the first place. That is to say, there's an incentive upon their side to create insecurities and create dissatisfaction with yourself, because that is the motivating force that is most likely to drive individuals to buy your product. That is why on their side, you cannot consider it a right, because the necessity to buy these products never existed without the advertisements in the first place. Secondly, we tell you that this is also, we tell you that even if this right were to exist to some extent, you necessarily need it to balance out. And a problem with consumerism that Stone highlights that they completely ignore is the fact that it is necessarily exclusive. That is to say, the value of a Yeezy is only valuable to the extent at which not everyone can access it. Because of that, consumerism has an incentive to make the products that they try to sell exclusive to those who can afford it. This then becomes problematic, because if individuals have a right to purchase these items, they probably shouldn't be coerced into buying the products that they cannot afford, spending their living wage on items that are not actually beneficial for them, but only ones that have been inflated by the advertisements that prioritize them. But thirdly, we would say if there was some sort of right for individuals to purchase the right product, we would much rather have a comparative, where they choose these items based off of functionality rather than the ones off of the advertising that they tell us about. The second thing that Stone told you about was the perverse incentives of advertisement. That is to say, things like objectifying women in car advertisements, or things like how models are oftentimes the only way to properly dress clothes, and because of it you create insecurities within individuals. The response here was firstly, that this was just justified because you were highlighting technical goods that were otherwise too dry. We think the unfortunate reality of this is that that's on our side. That on our side we do be able to highlight the best things in products because that's still focusing on the technical details. So to that extent we probably consume that part of their case. But the second thing that they told us is oftentimes you need these advertisements to illustrate things beyond what the technical aspects of the property are. The things like the values that your company may want to convey. And we think this is the point at which they concede to our case, right? Because they concede the fact that companies can oftentimes mischaracterize the products that they are selling. Now, the positive matter from opposition side is solely reliant on this one assertion. The assertion that every single message that is going to be passed is one that is good. Why is that unlikely, and why is that even if it is true, it is still a bad thing? The first thing to note here is that this is uniquely unlikely. Why? Because the best way this company know to actually sell their product is to make sure that everybody wants it. And the way in which you can do that is to create dissatisfaction within the customers. And that is why we told you they oftentimes had an incentive to drive in the insecurities of individuals. But secondly, note the fact that even if it was true, that some companies are promoting some good values, that these are always delayed in retrospective. That is to say, advertisement doesn't uniquely push forward the brunt of social change. And the reason why that is so is because advertisements want to appeal to the most people possible. That means even in their best case scenario, we're sure sometimes companies like Dove can tell you why their products cannot be uniquely masculine. That only happens after society already accepts things like that. Because that is the only way at which this type of marketing is ever able to actually reach a target audience. The third thing to note here is when they tell you that there's an incentive to be inclusive because there's oftentimes backlash. But note the thing about the problem with this argument is because it concedes the fact that there is a problem and that backlash is the way in which they try to solve it. And note that in this debate, it's not a net positive for you to try to heal the problems that advertisement has already created. It is a net benefit on our side when we tell you that we eliminate the problem as a whole and we can still give you more benefits because we change the way people perceive themselves away from the materialistic world that they tell you. Lastly, I just want to address the examples of things like how Delta promotes their charity. Firstly, if Delta promoting their charity is actually as mischaracterizing as you tell us, we're happy to ban it as well on our side. But the second thing to note is if buying Delta tickets as also a functionality of giving people charity, we think that's just a technical aspect of purchasing Delta tickets because the money that you put in also goes to charity. So if they want to advertise that, it's perfectly justified because it's another aspect of the product that they're trying to sell. Lastly then, let's talk about social change. We think the problem within society is oftentimes important social messages are contradicted or crowded out by advertisement. That is to say, it becomes extremely difficult to empathize with issues like race inclusion when the only thing that you see in advertisements are rich white people because that's the target audience that advertising companies want to hit. Importantly, this then means that corporations oftentimes have a superior incentive to sell their product rather than promoting the correct messages. So even if on their side they can name a few examples of good promotions, we think importantly what the problem is then is that the bad messages can oftentimes contradict the important social messages, and that on our side we're able to clear out this headspace. We're able to allow individuals to properly engage with the social messages that opposition side actually approves of. Because we think advertisement is oftentimes quite delayed when it comes to social messages, and it shouldn't be the way in which we try to change the public's appearance. Instead, we would rather take away the crowded information sphere that currently exists and allow for the important social messages to exist whilst products do what products need to do, which is focus on functionality so individuals can escape from the materialism that they want to talk about. Very proud to propose.
second speaker will cite proposition for delivering their speech, and I would now like to invite Emily as the second speaker of side opposition for delivering their
Had their last speaker deigned to take a POI from our side of the house, we would have said this. When we, as women of color, see a commercial for skin whitening products, we don't feel desperate and want to actually contribute and help to benefit our money to that company. Rather, we feel angry and want the ability to know that that actual product exists, to know that that company supports something that we are opposed to, and we think we are happy to be able to support things like Rihanna's makeup campaign for women of color to have more diversity in the makeup aisle. As consumers, we have the right to this kind of information. That information does not simply disappear, and that discrimination does not go away on their side of the house. The only thing that does is an individual's ability to know it exists. Very proud to oppose. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be engaging with all of the material you've heard so far, coming out of the proposition, before then delivering our third substantive argument about the destruction of certain businesses, namely advertising and small businesses. But now, let's get into what we heard coming out of the proposition side of the house. In response to their model, remember, we think it's pretty unclear as to what exactly it is they're defending. We ask a very simple POI. Would you allow commercials such as Delta to advertise the fact that they have campaigns in sub-Saharan Africa and support those communities? They said yes because it's somehow distinct. We don't think it is, insofar as they tell you the reason that these commercials happen is to make a profit. Even if Delta's incentive to advertise is to gain support, we would argue that's a good thing because it means these programs are more likely to happen, leading to more positive social change. But now, let's get into addressing the two key questions in the debate. The first argument that we hear in the point of clash is about this idea of whether or not advertisements have positive or negative messaging. We're going to analyze why we win on both fronts. They talk to us about this idea that we intensify stereotypes, and they tell us that advertisements pander to existing stereotypes, and thus will be discriminatory towards women and minorities. We have a few responses. First off, I challenge that the current trend of advertising is simply reinforcing negative stereotypes. Companies have structural incentives to cater to as many people as possible, and a moment of embracing positive social movements. For example, Black is beautiful, or more diversity, or more women in the actual positions of power. We think that is why, empirically, it is true. Look to the example of Dove's Like a Girl campaign, Audi's equal pay commercial, or Rihanna's makeup brand to service women of color. But now, let's engage them on their highest ground, because we think we want to be as direct as possible. If a company airs advertisements that perpetuate stereotypes, we think actually it can be a good thing for consumers to know those companies have biases. Why is this the case? First off, companies have a right to know if, or consumers have a right to know if that company is discriminatory. If I know that Aveeno uses a slogan that white is purity, I have a right to know to boycott them. But secondly, we do think that creates an effective check on these negative messaging through Backlash. We gave you two examples of this happening. The first is whenever Dell launched a laptop that was specifically made for women. Within that exact same month, the entirety of the laptop and the website correlated it was discontinued because of Backlash. The second example is the Kendall Jenner Pepsi commercial that we tell you led to a lot of backlash and more discourse in society, both of which means the companies are harmed, not supported. On the comparative, why is it so important for me to know what a company values? We think the standard that women, for example, should have lighter skin exists on both sides of the house, but it's only through marketing that we have a mechanism to expose and fight against that. But even so, let's talk about what commercials really look like. In the proposition world, we think it looks like simply having these kinds of technical information and not the message that is associated with it. Insofar as we tell you, we are the only side that has a mechanism to do things like spreading these positive messaging. We think that at that point, we win this argument on a pretty clear level. But now let's get into the second argument that they had, which we thought was quite strange, on combating consumerism. A few responses. First off, they never explain how changing commercials means that what actual individuals want will change or how consumerism will go down. Rather, consumerism and wanting to be rich existed long before advertisements did. Perhaps materialism has harms, but they do not combat that or explain why this is the case. They tell us that individuals ought to solely choose based off of functionality. We think advertisements beyond technological goods do just that because we think that individuals have the ability to know more about the companies themselves. That was the analysis they did not engage engage with. But for example, what we would additionally say is we can actually help to have better consumer choices. Look to examples of insurance commercials that display a family in a car crash. Oftentimes, it is these advertisements that, yes, might not simply be about a lot of data or facts, but that help individuals to realize how necessary some goods are. We are the only side that can access that benefit. But now let's talk about the argument about how competition is going to be harmed and how it's going to harm producers. We think our second the second prompt speaker claims that Ella didn't respond. She directly engaged this argument, even though they didn't get to it in Prop 1 until the 7-minute mark. We told you that technological details, exclusively being the focus of commercials, enables things like monopolization. For example, if only Apple is the one to be able to actually market off of how good their technology is, that means they have incentive to do things like aggressively increase patents and be able to actually take over larger shares of the market. At that point, competition only gets worse under their side of the house because of a lack of ability to distinguish themselves. The last argument is about this idea that we have checks on false advertising. First off, we said regulations promote fact-checking. Secondly, we can still punish companies through lawsuits and actual heavy fines from the government. Third, we can see things like counter-advertising. For example, with our own De Beers example, we think that actually other diamond companies had counter-examples about how they had more humanitarian ways to extract resources. And fourth, on backlash of the public to turn negative images. Before I get into the third argument, I'll take a point.
Not everyone responds so positively to stereotyping advertisement. Why is it the responsibility of those who react to it negatively to bear the burden of exposing corporations on your side?
We think that, for example, if I'm an individual like of color that sees an advertisement for skin whitening products, we think that first off, we can have large societal backlash to that, meaning that we can have more information on our side of the house that supports getting rid of these negative stereotypes altogether, like things like the Like a Girl campaign, like things like Rihanna's makeup brand. Let's go into our third argument. Our first layer of analysis is harms to the advertising industry. We want to take a moment to consider the huge volume of individuals involved in creating advertisements themselves. For example, behavioral scientists, copywriters, data analysts that consult with different testing groups, networking consultants, executives that run the businesses themselves, actors and actresses, indie commercials, video editors, sound editors, directors, artists, graphic designers. There are so many examples of this happening. We think, just to be clear, a lot of these skills aren't portable to other industries. That's just 12 of the many positions that compose the advertising industry. Advertising is a multi-billion-dollar industry in their side of the house. In order to access any of their benefits about combating consumerism, this industry necessarily needs to narrow and necessarily needs to suffer. We think that's problematic because at best, some networking jobs remain, but since the focus of the product itself is the only thing that's considered, the rest disappear, harming millions of individuals in that industry itself and all of their families. Our second layer of analysis is about limiting the content of ads that harm small businesses. This directly answers their argument about competition. In a world where we're just focused on technical details, that just means large companies can afford to advance technology and seek out high advertising with even more of an advantage. Small businesses benefit from being able to engage in things like creative marketing, or even marketing based on the fact that they are, yes, a small business. The proposition removes this mechanism for small businesses to distinguish themselves as a brand because now they only have to focus on the product itself. That constrains billions of dollars of economic productivity. They distort the abilities for small companies to differentiate themselves. At the end of the day, on every point of class that's come with the debate so far, we think it is too late for the proposition we are so proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the second speaker of opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the proposition to deliver.
We think that generally it is immoral to use consumers as a checking mechanism for the lack of regulation that governments have imposed. We think that generally the problems that they were talking about on their side of the house, of lack of diversity, of abuse of workers, of the ways in which companies produce their products that is immoral and unethical, are failures of regulation, not of customers. So I'm going to provide an explicit weighing mechanism as to why this principle is not justified, extending on what Brian said in his speech. Because we think it's very clear. Even if you generate better social outcomes, if the means to do this is fraudulent, if you are deceiving customers and taking away their choice and ability to take their own opinions into account, shape their own identity, and buy the products that they want, we would say that it is fraudulent, that we should therefore ban. Why? We would say that there is an intentional creation of a rift between expectations and reality on their side of the house. Now note, they do have good examples. The point is that the fact that there is pernicious and harmful advertising in and of itself justifies anything. Just because they are good examples is not good enough. When you are committing fraud, we say that there's a rift between expectations and reality. They create that in an analogous way. Why? Because the presumption of their case is that consumers purchase differently with advertising as opposed to without advertising. We would also say that consumers generally want to purchase based on the quality of the products. If you ask someone why they buy an iPhone, they're going to tell you they bought it because it's a good phone, not because of the logo on the back. However, we would say that when advertising creates specific incentives and creates a specific way that consumers view a product, that is malicious, that is fraudulent. Why? Advertising works in pernicious ways. No one actually thinks advertising works on them. As we told you from our first speech, advertising is a very subtle and influential force. People don't see a specific ad and then decide to buy that product. It is a lifestyle and culture that is built up with it. What happens then is that individuals are very often duped into buying into a certain lifestyle or believing that a certain lifestyle or product is better for them, as opposed to the rational assessment of whether that product is the best product for them in that instance. We would say then that that's incredibly problematic because advertising is pervasive. You can't avoid it. So in justification of market outcomes as to why we ban fraudulent advertisement, in justification of why we value the ability of individuals to select their own identity and form that, which is, I would note, the premise of democracy, because other people can't tell you what you should value, we would say then that we should ban these things. I'm going to ask two questions in the speech. Firstly, how do we promote better social values? Secondly, how do we get better market outcomes? Let's talk about social values. We told you that this leads to discrimination against three groups. Firstly, against women and minorities. We told you that these advertisements are based on an existing power structure, that the companies that are producing them may have some incentive to advertise to a larger group, but actually very often want to advertise exclusively. This creates a necessity to advertise in this way as well, because when one company is advertising a specific set of values, such as that when you get a car, you also get a girl, which is unfortunately what happens right now, other car companies also have to appeal to the same consumer base who has now bought into this ideology, meaning that it's very hard for companies to opt out of the existing power structures that they are generating on their side of the house. Their response was that there are inclusive narratives that are generated on their side. Here's the problem. We told you that these companies value the perception of exclusivity. That is to say that when you buy this car, you are part of an elite group, that you are better than other individuals, and therefore that you buy into this idea of exclusivity. But also secondly, we would say that there's an intrinsic need for products to set you down a little bit, or say that you are a little bit less than you otherwise would be, because otherwise you don't buy their product. We would say, therefore, that there's an incentive on their side to create exclusive narratives. What they said then is that there's going to be social activism and charity. Note firstly that this is outweighed by our impact, which is that it's fraudulent and deceiving to consumers and their identities. But secondly, that their net impact is very small. That these are things that we can and should be regulating. And note also that ads follow change. They do not create change. Which is to say that during the rise of feminism in, say, the 20th century, we would say that many ads that showed women like literally being under men's feet and literally being like abused and shackled to them actually regress change rather than progress change. For the simple reason that their market incentives operate based on existing social beliefs and structures. So you're never going to be the forefront of change, you are going to be the backrider of change. Which means that it's much harder to get revolution on their side of the house because the movements that they talk about are actively opposed by advertisements that are not supporting them. Note therefore that it is generally regressive due to the confirmation bias when people see one bad ad that is more influential than 10 good ads if people genuinely don't believe it. We think therefore that they don't get social change. It's very, very minor if they do at all. Secondly, this constrains the poor, unresponded to by their side of the house, because you create a more consumerist society. Now, when poor people are told that the only way to be successful, the only way to have value within your life is to buy this certain product, we would say that that's incredibly exclusive to many people around the world. Yes?
Okay, I would want to know, why would I want a majority male government to regulate what products can be sold to women?
I think that generally governments aren't as evil as you say they are, but even if that's the case, right, we would say that people, like, their ability to choose the product should be more influenced by their ability to choose the product rather than just like what the product is. To the extent that the product is actively harming you, that's something that you can pick, right? So if like a shirt is too small for you, you will buy a bigger shirt. But to the extent that it's not directly influencing you, we would say that the impact on you yourself is something that outweighs, right? We don't think that people should be like social battering rams influencing their own choice just to help other groups of people. Thirdly, this is an assault on individual sovereignty over their own identity. We told you that this creates a prescriptive narrative as to what your life should be. That's why Asian girls need to buy whitening cream and often scrub their faces vigorously just so they can be better. Their response was, this creates backlash, which cancels the effect. The problem is, it doesn't cancel the effect. These advertisements still play into the pernicious narratives that exist in many people's minds. And the problem is, many times the victims themselves are still afflicted, even if there's backlash, right? Just because someone said the advertisement is illegitimate doesn't mean it didn't have an influence on you, doesn't make you feel worse. What that crucially means then is that if there is hate speech, you shouldn't wait for people to criticize the hate speech. You should ban the hate speech because it's hurting people right now. We would also say that it's a poor way to form identity as a whole, because it's exclusive and competitive, which is like the sneaker market, right? Your sneakers are better than other people's sneakers because other people don't have those sneakers. We would say that this type of consumerism is a bad way to form identity. But finally, because there's a cycle of unhappiness, even if they argue that this makes consumers happier for some reason, it is only because it took them down a notch first. Now, let's talk about market outcomes. We think that it's very, very simple. We think that this necessarily decreases product quality. Why? Because generally, the ones with the most advertising budget tend to outcompete others, which means that all companies now need to dedicate a large sum of money toward advertising, decreasing the product quality. No, information is possible on both sides of the house, right? You can get reviews, you can read technical specifications, and you generally know what you need within your life. We don't need other people to tell us that. Their only response is small companies can talk about how they're small. The issue is that evidently doesn't work. Large companies tend to dominate the market in a system where advertising weighs out lower prices or better specifications, which is to say that they get worse products on their side and small companies cannot compete in ways like lowering their prices or in ways like, for example, having a simply better product. What they need to compare to then is the fact that large companies have significantly better advertising budgets and therefore structurally are better able to advertise. Ultimately, consumer choice should be in the weighing mechanism in this debate. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
delivering their speech. And now I would invite Layla to deliver less constructive speech of this debate.
Let's just summarize what we've heard from side proposition. Essentially, insecurities of the masses, racism, sexism, consumerism, and materialism, and ultimately, from the last speech, lack of revolutions will suddenly be solved on their side of the house when you place a product in a white box and just tell you the technical details of it. We think it's a bit absurd, and they went way too far in today's debate to try and say that they've simply accomplished absolutely everything that they've done, but insofar that they've chosen to do this, they underdeveloped a lot of their material, leaving it very easy for us to choose an opposition ballot. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. I'll be discussing two key questions that should summarize today's debate. The first, on which side does what's best for consumers. The second, on which side does what's best for industries. But let's go in to which side does what's best for consumers. Ultimately, down the bench, we have made our stance explicitly clear from the first speech onward. We think that there is more to a consumer's decision-making process rather than just stone-cold technical product details. There's many other factors. Why is this the case? We think that, in and so far that we live in an industry where there's multiple companies selling the same products, a lot of products choose to be relatively similar, meaning that if there's only telling you the technical product details, it's all going to look the same. That's why advertising is used in the first place, because they're trying to get a company to be able to succeed, to give unique things about their products that makes it a reason to buy into those products in the first place. But secondly, we tell you that the quality of products can come in many different ways. If the side proposition wants to tell you that quality is something that ought to be upheld, that's something that has to be valued within products, then it's explicitly clear that side opposition is the side that does that best for you, because we give you absolutely every mechanism to evaluate quality. When I'm holding a bottle of Suave body wash in one hand and Lush body wash in the other hand, I understand that they're relatively the same product, but when I look into the company, when Lush tells me that they're selling me this product and half of my contribution to this product will go to whatever movement they're supporting because they change their movements every month, we think that that's something that's going to sway me into buying that product over Suave, which is just abusing thousands of people in sweatshops to be able to send out massive amounts of products, right? That's the kind of information that I would never get on side proposition's house. It's not enough for them to tell you that, well, this information is irrelevant and that you should really only care about the ingredients inside my body wash. No, that's not the case. We think that that's an explicit reason to vote for the opposition. But what did we hear from side proposition under this point? Ultimately, they tell you that you hurt consumerism in essentially three key ways. The first is through consumerism, the second is through brand loyalty, and the third is through self-esteem that is going to be hurt by stereotypes used in advertising. The first two, based off of consumerism and brand loyalty, ultimately is not worthy of being valued in today's debate. Why is this the case? Because they completely underdeveloped this insofar that they gave you absolutely no reasoning as to why, when I only tell you the technical product details, suddenly consumerism magically goes away. They didn't finish writing the substantive. We think that insofar that that's the case, consumerism still exists within this world, consumerism still is going to happen. We ought to now evaluate whether or not it's quality consumerism, whether we're buying into companies that ought to be bought into. But we think that it's actually not necessarily a horrible thing if I, as a doctor, just want to buy a watch. They didn't tell you uniquely why somebody who wants to have materialistic tendencies is so atrocious in society. We think that it's a lot of a human instinct for people to just want nice things. That isn't something that we reject on side opposition. We think it's just inherent to human nature. But furthermore, we don't necessarily think that humans are some irrational actor that's just going to buy like 700 Yeezy pairs of shoes because they suddenly are going to get themselves into like going bankrupt. No, they're just going to buy one pair because they want a nice pair of tennis shoes. We don't think that's a point that stands on their side of the house. But let's really get into this issue of self-esteem, because this was a really big point on their side of the house and arguably their strongest argument. We told you two crucial things that only got engagement within their third speech. What were those things? We told you firstly, as society, especially now in this era, with movements such as Me Too or Black Lives Matter, there is a push to be extremely culturally sensitive in terms of marketing and advertisements. Why is this the case? Two key reasons. One, because companies are recognizing that they do bad things a lot of the times and they're wanting to make up for it, wanting to do the right thing. But secondly, they know that if they do something wrong, like produce a sexist ad or produce something that's super problematic, they're much more likely to have their entire company go under fire. We give you a lot of examples of this happening. Dell, when they produced laptops that were specifically designed for women, lost a massive amount of products being able to be sold to the public because everyone boycotted them for this. That's an instance of Backlash actually working. But furthermore, look to the Pepsi commercial of Kendall Jenner supposedly solving racism by sharing a Pepsi with a cop. We think that that's ultimately got a lot of backlash on Pepsi. Lots of people stopped buying the product. This incentivizes companies to make the rational call, to not be absolute jerks, and ultimately realize the right thing to do is not be racist or sexist. But even if they are perpetuating the stereotype, we think that that shows the company's true colors. When I'm looking at certain lotion brands, such as like Aveeno, and they start selling skin whitening commercials, I as a brown person am just going to be like, what the heck, Aveeno? I'm not going to buy you anymore, because I recognize that's super problematic in the long term. We think that ultimately, now we know what the company is doing, we're not going to stand with them. At worst, we think marginally a few people are harmed by these negative stereotypes, but their side will never be able to garner any of the positive benefits that can come from actual positive campaigns that happens within certain advertisements, such as always working for increasing women's rights, or Audi increasing equal pay within their business to be able to sell their products further, or Dove with their Like a Girl campaign. Those had massive amounts of benefits on society that improved a lot of things in the long term. The second question in today's debate is which side does what's best for industries? Two industries were ultimately presented in today's debate that are going to be affected under this motion. We think, firstly, it looks like just general companies trying to sell products when they know that they only have to focus on technical product details. I'm going to tell you why that's a little bit problematic. Let's hear a POI first.
Your case seems to be largely based on the idea of a right to choice. Even if you marginally expand the right to choice to some consumers, the majority of consumers are locked out due to the fact that they are now locked in to consumer loyalty due to optionality.
The thing is that your side of the house never tells us why consumerism or brand loyalty magically goes away when I put my product in a white box. That's too late in today's debate for them to be able to tell you that. But let's dig into why companies selling products, when they know that they only have to focus on technical product details, are going to solely engage with that. We think that when they have product details that are the main cause, the only way for them to be able to get consumers in the long term is for them to be able to patent everything. They're going to be able to consume the entire market. They're going to shut out other industries from being able to actually work. Why is this the case? Because they recognize that just only having products with technical details is the only way to sell your products. Well, then I'm going to want to have the most technical details to be able to sell my product in the first place. This means that secondly, they're going to ditch efforts such as social change because they don't benefit from it anymore, meaning that the ultimate stigmas in the workplace are going to continue to persist and social change is going to be stunted. But lastly, we think that it's not exclusive. If we want to appeal to literally as many, we think that these businesses are not exclusive. This is a false mischaracterization because companies are profit-based. They're going to want to get as much profit as in general. But lastly, we told you of smaller businesses. Smaller businesses always are going to want to have some sense of community. They're always going to want to be able to sell their products. When you only can talk about product details, you shut out small businesses from their key selling point, you destroy that market. We stand firm on opposition. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Linda and would like to invite Ella to deliver the last speech of the America.
The idea that light skin is somehow superior to dark skin is an idea as archaic, old, and toxic as literally the Indian caste system. Products designed to address this arose in response to existing problematic biases and ideas in society. On our side of the house, when we allow both companies to draw attention to these problems through marketing campaigns, but also other companies to check back against these very problems, we think that is the way that we actually solve such toxic social issues in society. We're very proud to oppose. 2 questions in the speech. First, which side creates the best social impact? And second, which side creates the best economic impact? Let's start with the social impact. First, as we tell you, we establish that all of the insecurities and problems that they talk about on their side of the house, as we tell you down the bench, aren't created by advertisers, but are just capitalized on by advertisers. What did we tell you down the bench when we actually draw attention to these problems and allow consumers to make decisions about whether they want to buy into and support such toxic ideologies? We actually create more discourse and can check back against these narratives. We tell you that because most companies are not selling exclusive luxury products, and in fact do want to cater to a large majority of people, they are much more likely, particularly as society progresses, to cater to more individuals and beat back against such toxic policies. But at worst, grant them that we marginally increase existing toxic ideas and insecurities. On their side of the house, they are never going to get the benefits that we tell you about in our second argument about promoting social movements and charitable efforts by companies. What did they tell you in response to this? The responses were both inadequate and in some cases a little bit offensive. They told us that governments should just engage in forcing companies to pursue these policies. Governments that are so coerced by problematic advertising apparently on their side of the house. We don't think this is likely. But also we don't think governments can force companies to engage in positive messaging or charitable work. That is only something that comes about when you give them a profit incentive for them to be able to promote these kinds of efforts to be able to sell products. When you allow companies like Delta to promote the fact that they're engaging in charity work that helps thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa, or a company like Ann Taylor to promote the fact that they're creating leadership programs for girls. But another argument that they came up in response to this was that, well, these advertising campaigns only come up when this movement has already begun. So they make absolutely no difference because the problem has already been solved. I am sorry. Does the pay gap not exist between women and men? Do ideas of toxic masculinity and discrimination not exist? We think that advertising campaigns to overthrow such toxic ideas may follow existing movements to do so, but uniquely promote these ideas, and we think that is incredibly important. But they say that they outweigh this because it's super coercive for me to buy an iPhone because I like the packaging. Well, I was going to buy a phone anyways. We don't think that it is ridiculously coercive, just even if we accept that people are just buying it because of the packaging to do so. But we also tell you that that individuals should factor in other things other than the technical product value. They should factor in things like the company's ideology, and that they have the right to do so. So on this question alone, we take the debate. But now let's move on into the second question in this round about the economic impact. Their link here is basically that people make more objective decisions because suddenly, because advertising doesn't exist, I don't want a Rolls Royce more than I want a Honda. We think that that dynamic existed on both sides of the house, and people have always wanted to buy better products and things like that. And as Layla tells you, they're not so irrational that they're going to destroy their financial futures in the name of consumerism. But we also told you about the value of appealing to simple, appealing messaging to explain to people what the benefits of a product are, particularly for really technical products that people otherwise wouldn't buy for financial gain. But we also told you about the impact on small businesses and the massive impact on the advertising industry. We think on the economic point, we also take today's debate. The marginal harms that they get on their side of the house do not outweigh the massive societal benefits and economic benefits we get on our side of the house. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the reply speech for the opposition and would like to invite the reply speech for proposition to cancel the vote.
I'm going to be quite frank. I wish I lived in the very narrow conceptualization of the world that we get from Team USA. That when I saw an Old Spice commercial or a Hollister commercial and I saw the person with ripped six-pack abs, I wouldn't feel bad about my own body. But unfortunately, that was not the reality of the world that we lived in. Not every individual lived in a liberal country and decided to become an activist the second they were able to identify the implicit messages that corporations stuffed into their advertisement. What was a lot more realistic was a world in which people, especially the ones who already lived in conservative circles, saw the advertisements that exploited their insecurities, exactly as PropReply told us. That when they capitalized upon these insecurities, it made it a lot worse, because they displayed them all across any facet of their lives. It meant that every single aspect of their person, everything that they purchased, was only done because of the insecurities that they saw. Because ultimately, all of the benefits of social change and backlash and exposing corporations only happened on their side. If individuals who were looking at these ads were so attentive enough that they were able to perceive the implicit messages that somehow they were able to get past, that they were the ones that were willing to act against it because they themselves were not insecure. Unfortunately, those confident activists may be Team USA, but they are not the vast majority of the world, and that is why it became problematic. That social change should probably be left up to the people who had the burden to carry it, not the individuals who had their lives demeaned because the advertisements told them that the life they live is not the satisfactory one to live. We told you social change should be left up to the political and social activists that are able to, once you were able to clear out the space that advertisements currently held. So then, I'm going to explain to you then in 3 areas why we won this debate, even on the consumerism side, even if we have lost the social change side. Firstly then, when it came to the quality of the products. And this is probably where they engaged upon us with the least. Because we told you that when functionality is the metric by which corporations have competition, it means that they improve their functionality, that they lower the cost, and importantly, individuals in lower socioeconomic statuses could access the benefits of capitalism that it always had promised them. But unfortunately, we're distracted because advertisement was a game that companies had to win. Importantly, this was a group of individuals that could now afford things like maybe a jacket on a cold winter night, and a group of individuals that opposition neglected, but we repeated to you through all of our speeches. Secondly, when it comes to the matter of choice, ultimately the opposition's reply to our argument about choice was that they told us there is a right to be materialistic. But the problem all along the bench that we characterized to you was that it is not a right if you do not have a choice. And the point at which, yes, maybe Ella wants to buy an iPhone, but every other individual in the society that cannot afford this iPhone now necessarily feels excluded. Because consumerism idealized the idea that you were the only one that was able to gain access to these attributes that define your core identity. Ultimately, we told you, a right cannot exist if it excludes the vast majority of the population. Yes, on their side, a rich man can feel benefited because they purchased the justifiable product. But on our side, we told you that everyone should have been justified because they should never have been coerced into buying the most expensive item, but the one that they needed most. Lastly then, on insecurities. The only solvency they had on their side to solve the problem of insecurities within advertisement was backlash. But that fell problematically on 2 assumptions that they made. The first one was that individuals could identify the implicit messages that oftentimes companies were hiding because they wanted to influence you without you realizing. We told you that was probably unrealistic. People don't see the fact that this company is trying to create negative stereotyping. What they see is the fact that this person has a much nicer body than the one that they possess, that they're dissatisfied because they aren't able to have that exact same lifestyle. Then, importantly, it means that even in their best case scenario, if we took them at the top of their case, some people, yes, might realize that advertisements are terrible, but most people will never realize that, and their lives will permanently be demeaned because those advertisements always seek to tell them that your life is not the life you should be living. Very proud to propose.
I think the first thing to say is well done to both teams. This was a spectacularly good debate. So congratulations on both sides. so close that it was a split. We went 2-1 with the maximum margin of difference by any one of the judges of 3 points. Two-side proposition. Okay, so let's give you a brief overview, and I'm going to try and keep this justification quite brief because I think the understanding of what happened is so complex and we've got lots of things that we can talk about that I think you'll get more of an understanding talking about it in more detail in person. Stylistically, we think that both Saims were excellent. We think that example usage down both benches was really good. Opposition maybe had a little bit of an advantage in the clarity of their example usage, so style, top marks across the board with maybe a slight advantage on side proposition. Strategically, we thought that both teams could have done a little bit better in this debate. We thought that the comparatives and the weigh-ups were a little bit fragmented. There was lots of them happening, but there wasn't enough work being done to tie the higher order themes together to make it easier for us as judges to do that evaluation. And we think that both teams had important characterizations that weren't properly examined. So we think that on both sides is maybe a bit of an exaggeration of the type of effects that we're talking about. The impact on the individuals and the types of examples being used on proposition versus the rationality and social impact on opposition. Both of these felt like they were maybe a little bit too extreme. We could have had discussions and characterizations that were more universal. In terms of how this debate played out, the different judges had sort of different structures of argumentation, which is probably a function of how much matter there was in this debate and the point that I made earlier about doing more in terms of weighing things up. The first argument on the effect, is this message that is coming from advertising harmful and what is the social impact, I think was the closest argument in the debate. Two of the judges thought that it went to proposition. One of the judges thought this argument went to opposition. From proposition we hear ideas that advertising is zero-sum, that it must necessarily create / exploit stereotypes, and in order for it to change your understanding or to change your behaviors, it must tell you that some aspect of your lifestyle or how you perceive yourself is wrong. On opposition side, we have the idea that we have a trend towards positive social messages, that there's a backlash and discourse mechanism, and that these stereotypes already exist. On the whole, we think that that's true in some cases, but maybe not universally true. Whereas the mechanisms and the behaviors that exist in proposition side are probably a little bit more universal, and therefore two of the judges gave more credit to that. Having said that, one of the judges did think that your interpretation of the social message and your strategic push on the social message was enough to win that point for you. Effects on competition was the second point that we used to evaluate this debate. On the prop side, we get that it reduces quality, reduces the incentives for innovation, necessarily by the fact that it is changing the mechanism used for competition. I think this argument is underdeveloped in the proposition case. It comes through late in P1, and the later speakers don't develop it much. Having said that, we think that the opposition response is quite weak, in that it mainly points to this idea of other mechanisms of competition, such as patents, and we don't see how that's significantly different from the status quo, why our companies are not in the status quo competing on both of these. Having said that, your response was enough to convince one of the judges on the panel, and that argument on competition went to you in the eyes of one of the judges. I do just want to say and point out on the strategic note that there was a secondary point of consideration here. What happens to the advertising industry presented by the op team? We don't think that proposition engages this, but equally we think that opposition doesn't make it strategically important relative to the rest of this point on competition. So you leave it to the judges to do that way up. And ultimately we felt that, and all of the judges agreed here, that this point didn't advance the debate because it wasn't made strategically valuable. Then the last idea was that of choice and how does consumer choice change and how is it impacted. On the opposition side, we've got the idea that this information is required, that it creates a charitable incentive, and that these are important things for consumers to know about. On the proposition team, we've got ideas that there's a subconscious decision making and that we've got a consumerist behavior that's driven by this. These ideas in my mind, so me specifically, don't clash well in this debate, and I really struggled to award choice. One of the judges thought that the universality of the proposition arguments was sufficient to win choice, whilst the discussion around charity, etc., was, again, plausible but not universal. So, lots of opinions in terms of how this debate weighed up, but on those, across those three issues, we think that there was sufficient points being won by proposition to give them the debate.